Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
The champagne was still fizzing in my glass when Rachel stood up with that smug little smile plastered across her face, the kind of smile that made it obvious she knew exactly what she was doing, and worse, that she didn't care who she was hurting as long as the spotlight found her. We were just beginning the toast. My fiancé Tom had just finished saying a few clumsy but sweet words about how lucky he was to be marrying me, and everyone clapped, even my mother, who never particularly warmed to him. The room was still echoing with laughter when Rachel's voice cut through, sharp and clean. "Before we finish these toasts," she said, placing one hand over her stomach with theatrical precision, "Kyle and I have something we'd like to share." She paused for effect, because of course she did, and then dropped the bomb like she was tossing confetti into the wind. "We're expecting." There was a beat of silence, just one, short enough to be missed, but long enough to slice me open, and then the entire room erupted into applause. Someone whistled. My Aunt Marlene practically screeched, "Oh my God, that's wonderful." And my mother? My mother clutched her chest and cried. Real tears. For her golden child. The same woman who, only moments earlier, had barely smiled when Tom slipped a ring onto my finger. I smiled. I smiled so hard my cheeks ached, and I clapped like my palms weren't shaking, and I stood up and hugged her, because that's what older sisters are supposed to do, right? Support. Celebrate. Suppress. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why she couldn't have waited. I didn't remind her that this night wasn't about her. I just stood there in my new dress, with my new ring, trying not to feel like the ghost at my own party. Rachel has always known how to turn every room into her stage. Growing up, she could cry on cue, fake an injury for attention, or turn a scraped knee into a family crisis. And the worst part? Everyone fell for it, every single time. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need saving, the one who handled her business, kept her grades up, held jobs, paid rent, and watched our father slowly rot away in hospice while Rachel posted bikini photos from some lake house in Tahoe. But no one remembered any of that. They remembered how pretty she looked when she smiled, how charming she was at dinner, how she lit up the room, always the goddamn room, always hers to light up. I shouldn't have been surprised, and yet, when she made that announcement on that night, I felt something inside me twist, like a rope pulling tight around my lungs. This wasn't some random dinner or casual brunch. This was my engagement party. Tom had worked his ass off to plan something simple and sweet, because he knew I didn't want anything flashy. Just close friends, some music, some laughter, a few heartfelt speeches, and a quiet sense of love in the air. And for about 45 minutes, that's exactly what it was. Until Rachel swallowed it whole. I watched as the attention shifted, like the sun had moved in the sky and cast a shadow over me. My engagement ring, which everyone had been admiring just 10 minutes earlier, suddenly didn't seem so dazzling. No one cared about wedding dates or venues anymore. They wanted to know if Rachel had names picked out, if she was going to find out the gender, if the baby was a surprise or planned. The attention moved to her like iron filings to a magnet, and I stood there, frozen, wondering if anyone else noticed how quickly I'd disappeared from my own celebration. Tom leaned over at one point, his hand slipping gently over mine. He asked me if I was okay, and I nodded like a puppet. I even managed a soft, "Of course I am," because what else could I say in that moment? That I wanted to scream? That I wanted to throw my glass into the fireplace and tell everyone to go home? That I wanted, just once, to not be the background character in my own life? We made it through the rest of the evening with strained smiles and half-hearted laughter. I posed for pictures I won't ever look at again, answered questions about venues and dresses like I hadn't just been blindsided, and hugged Rachel goodbye like she hadn't gutted me in public. And as I closed the door behind the last guest, Tom turned to me and said, "She didn't mean to steal the night." I didn't answer. Because of course she meant to. It wasn't the first time Rachel had pulled a stunt like this. There was my college graduation, when she showed up late in a tight white dress and cried in front of the whole family about breaking up with some guy I'd never even met. There was my 30th birthday dinner, when she brought a +1 who turned out to be my high school ex, who'd just moved back to town and didn't realize I was the guest of honor. Rachel has made a sport of stealing moments from me, and everyone's just too charmed or too blind to call her out. But that night, something shifted inside me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't call her out. I just smiled and nodded and hugged her one last time. And then I sat on the edge of my bathtub at 2 in the morning, scrolling through the guest list with numb fingers and a different kind of fire burning in my chest. Because this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. This time, I wasn't going to fade into the wallpaper and wait for the next moment to be taken from me. This time, I was going to take something back. And so, around 3:30 in the morning, while Tom snored in the next room and the house smelled like leftover champagne and wilting roses, I started typing an email. A save the date. But not the one people were expecting. Not the one Rachel would have seen coming. I smiled again, but it wasn't the same kind of smile. This one felt sharp. Satisfying. Because if she thought she'd taken the spotlight for good, she had no idea what was coming. I wish I could say that Rachel's stunt at my engagement party was the first time she twisted a knife between my ribs with that polished smile of hers and got away with it, but the truth is, she's been doing it for as long as I can remember, and the saddest part is, our family let her, hell, they practically applauded her for it. As I lay in bed that night, eyes wide open and fingers clenched around my phone like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality, I wasn't just thinking about what she'd done this time, I was reliving every single time before. Like my brain had turned into a projector screen and was forcing me to watch the same damn movie I thought I'd burned years ago. There was the time I made valedictorian in high school, a moment that should have belonged to me entirely, something I had worked years for, staying up until 2 in the morning, dragging myself through AP classes and community service projects, all to give that final speech on graduation day. But Rachel, who was barely a freshman and had failed algebra twice, showed up wearing a dress that made every male in the crowd turn their head and spent the entire ceremony crying in the bathroom because her boyfriend had broken up with her the night before. By the time we got to dinner, no one cared about my speech or the scholarships I had lined up. They just wanted to know if Rachel was okay. She sat there like a wounded dove while I tried to swallow resentment with each bite of overcooked steak, and I remember thinking back then that maybe she didn't mean to do it, that it was just bad timing, that it wasn't intentional. But by now, I know better. I've seen the pattern too many times. In college, she accidentally showed up at my apartment the same weekend I was supposed to be celebrating my new job offer with friends, and wouldn't you know it, she had just been dumped again and needed a place to crash. And suddenly my Friday night turned into a sobfest with Rachel front and center, crying into my throw pillows and drinking the wine I had bought for a toast that never happened. And don't even get me started on the time she borrowed my dress for a New Year's Eve party, met a guy there, and then introduced him to the family 6 months later like she hadn't taken him straight from under my nose. So no, her little, we're expecting declaration wasn't new behavior, it was classic Rachel. She plays the victim when it suits her and the queen when it benefits her. She's a master of manipulation dressed in soft curls and cashmere, the kind of person who will hand you a glass of champagne with one hand while loosening the rug beneath your feet with the other. And yet, for most of my life, I've let it slide. I've let it slide because it was easier than fighting. Easier than trying to explain to people who only saw her surface just how sharp she could be beneath it. But the night of my engagement party changed something fundamental in me, something I didn't fully understand until the next morning, when I got a text from my friend Jess, someone who knows me well enough to wait until the chaos settles before she gives me the truth. Hey, the message said, did you know Rachel was texting Kyle like 2 months before they got together? He was seeing someone else then. A friend of mine. It got ugly. I stared at my phone, heart thudding, suddenly unsure what it was I was feeling. Was it shock? No, not really. Disgust? Maybe. But more than anything, I felt curiosity curling around the edges of my frustration like smoke, because if Rachel had once again managed to turn someone else's life upside down to center herself in a story that didn't belong to her, then I needed to know exactly how far the damage went this time. I called Jess. She picked up on the first ring. You remember Abby? She asked. The one who transferred from Arizona State? I did. Quiet girl. Big eyes. Used to sit in the back row of sociology and write in the margins of her textbooks with a pink pen. Well, she was seeing Kyle, Jess said, until Rachel happened. Abby found out the hard way. They were hooking up, nothing official yet, but Rachel knew. They'd met before, briefly. And suddenly Rachel starts showing up at the same bars, then starts accidentally running into Kyle at the gym, then boom, Abby gets ghosted and Rachel is posting matching sweaters on Instagram. That image of Rachel in her perfectly filtered world, smiling next to Kyle like she hadn't left a crater behind her, snapped something in me. I asked Jess if she still talked to Abby, if she knew where she was now, and when Jess hesitated, I could already feel the idea forming in the back of my mind like a thundercloud gathering on the horizon. She moved back to Arizona, Jess said. But she's online. I'll send you her info. I hung up, thanked her, and stared out the window for a long while, watching the late morning light move across the kitchen tiles like it was searching for something. Rachel had bulldozed yet another person, and now she was standing at the center of my engagement party, holding her stomach like a goddamn trophy, pretending none of it had ever happened. The thing is, I've never liked revenge stories. They always seemed cheap to me, too dramatic, too petty. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about clarity. About balance. About making sure, for once, Rachel couldn't just rewrite the story and have everyone applaud while she erased the bodies behind her. I reached out to Abby that afternoon, introduced myself, told her who I was, asked if she might be open to talking. And when she replied, not only with yes, but with a surprising eagerness to be heard, I knew that I was holding something in my hands that Rachel couldn't take back this time, not with charm, not with tears. Not with that smug grin she hides behind when the truth starts to catch up. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with what I found. Not yet. But I knew I was going to do something. Because Rachel? She's done this before. But this time, I wasn't just going to let her walk away from it. This time, I wasn't going to be quiet. When you've spent your entire life watching someone else bend the rules without consequence, when you've watched them interrupt, overshadow, and manipulate the narrative to fit their own needs, there comes a moment, sometimes quietly and sometimes with the weight of thunder, when you realize that the only way to reclaim the ground beneath your feet is to stop playing the part of the understanding, polite sister and start becoming something far more precise, far more dangerous, and far more deliberate. For me, that moment came 2 days after the party, while I stood in my kitchen with a lukewarm mug of coffee in my hand, staring blankly at the wedding inspiration board on my laptop screen, wondering what the hell I was even planning for anymore. Because every piece of it, every dress swatch, every menu option, every floral arrangement, now felt like a rehearsal for a performance that no longer belonged to me. Tom, to his credit, hadn't brought up Rachel's announcement since the night of the engagement party. He had that quiet way about him, that tendency to let me have space without asking if I needed it, which I appreciated, though in that particular moment, I also resented it, because part of me wanted someone to scream with, to rage with, to ask me how she could have done this and why everyone had let her. But Tom was measured, thoughtful, and above all, rational, and right now I didn't want rational. I wanted justice. So when I told him that I thought we should move the wedding up, dramatically up, in fact, to the following weekend, he didn't push back immediately. He just looked at me with that careful, searching expression of his, the one that made me feel like a subject under observation, and asked, "What's the rush?" I could have lied, could have said it was about availability, about weather, about simplicity, but instead I looked him square in the eye and said something that felt more honest than anything I'd spoken in days. Because I'm tired of letting other people decide how and when I get to celebrate my life. He hesitated, and for a moment I thought I'd lost him, that maybe he'd sensed the deeper motivations crawling beneath the surface of my words. But then he reached for my hand, gave it a squeeze, and simply said, "Then let's do it." And that was it. Permission granted. Plan activated. I spent the next 48 hours combing through every list I'd ever made, cutting out the frills, the fuss, the traditions that meant nothing to me and clung only to the core pieces: a dress, a venue, a minister, food, music. and a guest list short enough to fit inside a living room, but curated well enough to shake the ground beneath Rachel's feet when the day came. Because the truth was, this wasn't just about the wedding anymore. This was about the speech. The reveal. The moment I could finally shift the narrative in my favor, not with a sob story, not with drama or spectacle, but with precision. But I wasn't just planning a ceremony. I was also preparing a different kind of moment, one that had nothing to do with vows or rings. Because in the background of all this, my conversation with Abby had evolved into something else, something that confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't dared say out loud yet. It wasn't just that Rachel had swooped in and taken Kyle from her. It was how she had done it. The layers of deceit. The games. The timing. Rachel had always operated like a magician, drawing your eyes to one hand while the other worked the trick, but Abby had seen the sleight of hand, had felt the sting of betrayal before the applause drowned it out, and she had the messages, the screenshots, the timestamps to prove it. When I asked Abby if she'd be willing to share the full story, she said yes, quickly, without hesitation, like she'd been waiting for someone to finally ask. And when I read the thread of messages between her and Kyle, complete with flirtations and plans made well after Rachel had claimed she and Kyle were already serious, something inside me settled, not with satisfaction, not yet, but with clarity. This wasn't just about me. Rachel had hurt someone else, and she'd done it like she always did, gracefully, quietly, with a smile that made people forget the mess behind it. But not this time. This time, I had something of hers. Her own pattern. Her own method. And I intended to use it. On the third night, I sent out the wedding invitations, not the handcrafted cardstock I'd ordered months ago, not the ones sitting in a drawer still waiting to be addressed, but a short, direct email with the subject line, "Change of plans, you're invited." In it, I explained the new date, the new location, and offered a simple explanation that Tom and I had realized what mattered wasn't the scale or the spectacle, but the intimacy and the meaning of the moment. And while all of that was technically true, it wasn't the full truth. The full truth was that I was tired of letting Rachel choreograph my milestones. Of course, I knew how this would land. Rachel would be confused, maybe even a little annoyed that we'd moved up the wedding without her input. She'd probably complain to our mother, accuse me of impulsivity, or worse, try to paint it as another example of my sensitivity. But I didn't care. I wasn't doing this to be liked. I wasn't doing it to compete. I was doing it because I knew Rachel wouldn't see it coming, and for once, that element of surprise, the very tactic she'd mastered so well, was finally mine to use. What I didn't expect, however, was how easily the pieces fell into place. The venue was available. The minister was free. My dress fit without needing another alteration. And the guests I truly wanted there, those who'd texted me after the engagement party with quiet concern and not just empty congratulations, replied to the new invitation with a level of enthusiasm that made me realize something I should have known all along. This was never about the number of people in the room. It was about who saw me. And that included Rachel. Especially Rachel. She hadn't responded to the invitation. Not yet. But I could already imagine her reaction, mouth slightly open, phone in hand, confusion bleeding into disbelief. Because no one ever moved faster than Rachel. No one ever beat her to the next step. Until now. The next day, I sent one more email. Just one. A private message, not to my guests, not to my family, not to Tom. But to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A name Rachel hadn't said out loud since college. A name I knew would still have weight. And when he replied, within the hour, I didn't even need to read the whole message. The first sentence was enough. Of course I remember her. And suddenly, the wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a reckoning. The sky was still carrying the color of early morning silence when I stood by the mirror, staring at the version of myself I hadn't met before, a woman wrapped in satin, lips steady, eyes dry. Heart thudding not with nerves, but with an anticipation so cold and focused that even the soft light brushing against my skin couldn't distract me from what this day had come to represent. This wasn't just a wedding, not anymore. It wasn't the culmination of a love story or the beginning of a forever wrapped in fairy lights and first dances. It was a moment of deliberate clarity, A turning point dressed in vows and white lace, a ceremony disguised as something pure, when in truth, what I had built was an execution. And the one thing I had decided with absolute certainty was that this would be the last time Rachel stole anything from me without consequence. Tom, ever calm, ever collected, was in the next room, likely buttoning his cuffs with the same careful hands that had held me through so many quiet evenings and whispered that he loved me without needing it to be loud or noticed. He didn't know the full scope of what was coming, how could he? I had told him only what I needed to, that today would be different, that the guest list had shrunk by design, that there would be no choreographed dance, no overdone cake. Just a quiet exchange of promises, and then a brief celebration among people who knew how to sit still and actually listen. But Rachel would be there. Of course she would. She couldn't resist a stage, even one she wasn't meant to own. I knew she'd accepted the last-minute invitation because her silence had finally broken with a single text the day before. Wow. Sudden. Everything okay? No congratulations. No genuine curiosity. Just that thinly veiled challenge, as if trying to gauge whether the ground she always assumed was hers had started to shift beneath her heels. I hadn't answered. And now, as the florist placed the last bundle of white roses along the altar and the sound crew adjusted the single microphone at the center of the room, I inhaled deeply and imagined the moment she would walk in, fashionably late, of course, with Kyle trailing behind her like a well-trained accessory, her hand hovering over her barely visible bump as if its existence alone granted her immunity from criticism. I pictured her surveying the room, instantly noting the difference. No grandeur, no long rows of strangers, no excess. Just intention. And I imagined the subtle panic that would flicker in her eyes when she realized she wasn't the story here. She wasn't even a chapter. The ceremony itself was, admittedly, beautiful in its simplicity. Tom's voice trembled just enough to make the vows feel real, and when I spoke mine, I chose every word with the kind of restraint that comes only when you've lived long enough to know that performance and authenticity can sometimes look very much the same. We kissed to polite applause, the kind that comes not from surprise but from quiet approval, and then, as planned, we moved into the adjacent room for the reception, a long table set beneath hanging lights. The kind of arrangement that encourages people to stay seated, to look at one another, to listen when someone stands to speak. Dinner was served quickly, intentionally. I kept one eye on Rachel the entire time. She looked beautiful, of course, always did, in that expensive and practiced way that never quite softened the sharpness underneath. She spoke to her mother in hushed tones, sipped sparkling water like it was champagne, and laughed a little too loudly when someone made a passing joke about newlyweds. But what she didn't do was interrupt. Not yet. She was waiting, calculating, likely assuming she'd have a moment to shine, perhaps during dessert, perhaps with a sentimental toast about sisterhood and shared milestones. But I had already claimed that slot. When the plates were cleared and the room quieted just enough, I stood up slowly, glass in hand, and cleared my throat, not because I needed attention, but because I wanted to make sure I had it completely before I began. Every eye turned to me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch beneath the weight of it. "I'd like to thank you all," I began, voice steady, tone warm but unmistakably controlled, "for being here today, for showing up not just for Tom and me, but for what this day really represents, which, for me, is about choosing clarity over chaos, truth over comfort, and love that's rooted in honesty." There were polite nods, soft smiles. Rachel tilted her head slightly, her fingers tightening around her glass. I continued, "It's funny how people think weddings are about perfection, about curated images and flawless timelines, but in truth, real commitment isn't about a perfect day. It's about what we're willing to carry, what we're willing to see, and what we're no longer willing to ignore." At that, I reached into the small clutch hidden beneath my chair, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, not dramatic, not theatrical, just quiet, and placed it on the table in front of me. The room was still. No one spoke. "I want to raise a toast," I said, lifting my glass just slightly, to letting go of old roles, old patterns, and to finally saying what should have been said a long time ago. And then, without fanfare, without trembling, I read aloud the printed transcript, an exact reproduction of text messages between Kyle and Abby, beginning with flirtation, veiled promises, and clear intimacy that stretched far beyond Rachel's carefully constructed timeline of their relationship. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I simply read. Dates times names. Rachel's face, which had held that rehearsed expression of polite interest, began to shift slowly as recognition dawned. Her posture stiffened. Her eyes narrowed, lips parted just slightly as if preparing to interrupt, but she didn't. She couldn't. When I finished, I placed the paper down and said, "Sometimes the truth comes wrapped in silence." But today I chose not to stay silent. And then I sat down. The room didn't erupt. There were no gasps, no dramatic outbursts. Just the weight of silence settling over everyone like a thick curtain slowly descending. Our mother looked like someone had knocked the wind out of her. Kyle stared straight ahead, jaw tight. And Rachel, she sat frozen, blinking rapidly, as if trying to decide whether to cry or scream or walk out without acknowledging any of it. But she didn't move. She didn't say a word. And in that moment, I realized I had finally taken back what had been mine all along, not the spotlight, not the applause, but the narrative. I had changed the shape of the room. I had turned her own tactics against her, not with vengeance, but with a kind of clarity she had never seen coming. Later, as people began to filter out, murmuring their goodbyes with hesitant glances, Tom came to stand beside me. He didn't ask why I did it. He didn't try to analyze the fallout. He simply said, "That was the most honest thing I've ever seen at a wedding." And I nodded, because that was the point. Not to humiliate. Not to destroy. But to finally, definitively, tell the truth. And as Rachel quietly slipped out the side door, eyes red, hand no longer resting proudly on her stomach, I knew that for once, she'd leave the room carrying more weight than she ever intended. The morning after the wedding unfolded in an unsettling hush, not the peaceful, romantic stillness that some women dream of waking into on the first day of married life, but a quiet that hung heavy in the air, as though the very walls were absorbing the aftershock of what had taken place the evening before. The sun, stretching cautiously across the hardwood floors of our rented suite, felt less like a warm beginning and more like a spotlight slowly creeping toward whatever truth had been left behind in the cold. Tom was still asleep, one arm draped gently over the edge of the bed, his breathing deep and steady, untouched by the emotional fallout that had, without a doubt, begun to ripple through our family's fragile ecosystem. But I was wide awake, sitting in the corner chair wrapped in a hotel robe, hands clasped around a mug of coffee I hadn't touched, eyes locked on the wall in front of me as if it might reveal something I hadn't already guessed. My phone vibrated once, then again, a series of small, persistent tremors that reminded me the world outside that room hadn't stopped spinning just because mine had narrowed down to one deliberate act of exposure and the countless implications that followed. I didn't need to check to know who it was. I didn't want to read the messages, not yet. Because deep down, I already knew what they'd say, or worse, how they'd feel, that blend of shock and accusation and guilt masquerading as hurt. But the truth is, I wasn't feeling triumphant. Not exactly. What I felt was something far more complicated, something closer to the exhaustion of finally laying down a burden you've carried for far too long, only to realize that the weight didn't vanish, it simply changed shape. Rachel hadn't spoken to me after the reception. She hadn't made a scene, hadn't confronted me in the bathroom or cornered me near the exit or thrown a drink in my face like you might expect from a woman exposed in such a public and calculated fashion. No, instead, she left the room with a kind of eerie composure, one hand gripping her purse too tightly, the other brushing aside her hair like she was still trying to maintain the image of the woman who hadn't just had her entire version of events dismantled in front of family and friends. And I, in turn, hadn't followed her, hadn't explained, hadn't defended myself, because I'd spent years doing just that, years being the one to smooth things over, to absorb the blame, to apologize for making her uncomfortable, for drawing attention, for being too much or too little depending on the mood she decided to set that day. It was Tom who finally stirred, his eyes slowly opening as he registered my unmoving figure across the room, and when he sat up and asked, in that groggy voice of his, "You okay?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wasn't sure he wanted the real one. But to his credit, he waited. And when I finally spoke, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't poetic, it was just the plain, jagged truth. I think I broke something that was already cracked. He didn't flinch. He nodded slowly and said, maybe it needed to break. Later that afternoon, we drove home in near silence, both of us lost in thought, the only sound the low hum of the highway and the occasional shuffle of the radio. My phone continued to buzz, texts from my mother, from one cousin I rarely speak to, from Jess, who simply wrote, "Damn. Proud of you." And then finally, from Rachel herself. I didn't open it right away. I stared at the notification on my lock screen, the preview short and clipped. Hope it was worth it. 6 words, no punctuation, no warmth, just a dull blade pressed flat against the skin. Not enough to cut, but more than enough to bruise. I deleted the message without replying. Because what could I possibly say to her that hadn't already been said? Not with words, but with the quiet fury of facts, with the sharpness of honesty finally laid bare in a room full of people who had, for too long, looked the other way. What could I say that she would hear now, that she hadn't already dismissed 1,000 times before under the guise of sisterly rivalry or jealousy or overreacting? The answer, I realized, was nothing. The story wasn't hers to rewrite anymore. And my silence would say far more than any defense could. But still, as the hours passed and the weight of what I'd done settled more fully into my chest, I found myself watching an old home video that I hadn't seen in years, one that had been buried in a forgotten folder on my laptop. Christmas morning, 1999. I was 10. Rachel was 8. Our father, still alive then, was behind the camera, laughing as we tore through wrapping paper with the kind of unfiltered joy only children know. I watched as I held up a sweater and grinned, proud of it even though it was hideous, and then Rachel shrieked as she unwrapped something shinier, louder, more exciting. The camera shifted toward her, and from that moment on, it stayed there. I paused the video and stared at the frozen image, Rachel in mid-laugh, eyes wide, arms stretched toward the lens, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I just felt distance. A clean, irrevocable line drawn between who we were then and who we had become now, between the girl who always knew how to catch the light and the one who had learned, slowly and painfully, to survive in the shadows. What happened at my wedding wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty or performance or spite. It was something else entirely. It was reclamation. And if it stung, if it shattered illusions or strained relationships or turned a few heads, then maybe that's what it took for the truth to finally be seen for what it was: messy, uncomfortable, and long overdue. I didn't take the spotlight from Rachel that night. I just took it back. And what she chooses to do now, whether she rebuilds, retaliates, or retreats, is no longer my concern. I didn't destroy her. I didn't need to. I simply made sure she couldn't destroy me anymore.